All right. Well, thank you all for being here on this Wednesday evening. We are here for the City of Elk Grove's Climate Compass Community Workshop. This is the first workshop for this effort. My name is Hannah Kornfeld. I'm with Ascent Environmental, serving as the project manager for the consultant team that is supporting the city. And I would like to introduce Carrie Whitlaw with the city to begin the presentation part of this meeting.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see if we get some additional participants coming in the next few minutes, but we really appreciate all of your time out of your evening. I know this is key time with family and dinners, and so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. If you want to go to the next slide, Hannah. So we wanted to do a quick agenda. So we will do some introductions in a moment. We'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves, and we'll introduce the team from the city and from Ascent who's here tonight. We're going to do a quick overview around the Climate Compass. Some of you may have heard about it before at some of our climate ambassador meetings or at other things that we've done, but this will we'll do a quick overview. We're going to talk then some about the greenhouse gas inventory. We've just completed that, and so we'll go through a little bit of the data that we have from that and talk specifically about Elk Grove and the key climate hazards that we are going to be experiencing here. We do want to try and do, if we get a few more participants, we'll do some different breakout groups. If we have a smaller group, we'll stay together, but we really want to hear from you and do an activity with all of you to hear about what you think are the community strengths and the weaknesses that we need to then reflect and address as we put together our Climate Compass. And then before we end, we will take any questions people have and talk about what some of the next steps are with this. So are there any quick questions on that? We do want to make sure everybody is familiar with using Zoom. Hopefully, after the past couple of years with all of the online everything, people are pretty familiar, but we do want to point out, right, the mute button down on the bottom left-hand side. When you're speaking, feel free to come off mute, but if you're not speaking, please keep it muted just to be a little bit quieter. For those listening, you can turn on or off your video. We always encourage people to have their videos on, but we recognize that, you know, other things are interfering at home, and so that doesn't work for everybody. There's also the chat button down in the middle, and we'll ask people in a minute to introduce themselves in the chat, so you can click if you want to have that opened. You can put any questions or comments in there as we go through. You're also welcome. There's reactions. If you want to raise your hand to, you know, interrupt and ask a question, feel free to do that in the reactions, or if you want to, you know, make a reaction to anything that's being said, you can do that. And again, if you leave the meeting, it doesn't disrupt everyone else. Other people will be able to stay, but you can hit that leave button there as well. And then the next slide is if you need closed captioning, that is an option. If you don't see it along the bottom, there are the three little buttons that say more, and you can open the closed. It has the closed captioning there, and you can put subtitles. You're even actually able to make the text larger if that is needed and helpful with that closed captioning. So those are all some of the features in Zoom to help. So we are going to ask everybody to introduce themselves. So if you open your chat and, you know, in the chat, share your name. We'd love to have, you know, your zip code of residence, right? We can always like to know where within Elk Grove people are from and make sure we're getting people across the different city. If you are just a resident, that's great. If you're with a specific organization, you can put your affiliation in there as well. And then we want to hear a little bit about favorite place in Elk Grove. So if you have a favorite place that you like in Elk Grove, feel free to put that in there. I always have a hard time sort of narrowing it down to one favorite place, right? I really like our District 56 facility and the preserve, but I also like the trail along Whitelock, which is near my house, and being able to walk there. I also have favorite restaurants. I really like Journey to the Dumpling is one of our personal favorites in my house. So narrowing it to just one is always a little bit tough, but feel free to put those in the chat so we can get to know you all a little bit. Is anyone having trouble with that? Or is that working okay for folks? While you all are doing some introductions in the chat, I also wanted to make sure that we are introducing the team from the city who's here tonight and from Ascent. So as Hannah mentioned, I'm Carrie Whitlock. I'm the project manager for the Climate Compass project. Crystal Love-Lazard is here as well from the city. She is the community engagement and government relations manager for the city, and many of you may have met her previously. Kayla Ball is also here with the city. She's our Civic Spark Fellow, who is helping us on a lot of environmental projects. We also have from Ascent, we have Hannah Kornfeld, who's here. She's the project manager from the Ascent side. And Luis Montes is the assistant project manager. He's here and will help be facilitating some of our breakout rooms. We have John Stepanek and Natalie. I'm not going to say it right, Natalie.
Kataoka.
Thank you. They are also with Ascent and are going to be helping with facilitation and note taking in the breakout rooms. And it looks like people are putting in some of their favorites, some Camden Lake, and Oasis Park is a nice new park that we have. I like that one. And somebody clearly is a pickleball fan because they are some of the few pickleball courts right here in Elk Grove. So it's always nice to see the preserve. I like somebody else has the preserve as a favorite place. It is a great park that we have. So thank you for putting those in there. Should we? Yep. Thank you, Hannah. So we are going to go through the Climate Compass and do a little bit of an overview. To start with, we wanted to do a few key terms and make sure sort of everybody's on, even playing field with some of the terminology we'll be talking about this evening. So greenhouse gases, right, are those that trap heat in the atmosphere. These are the ones, the greenhouse gas emissions are what are causing our climate change, right? That long-term shift in temperature and weather patterns being driven by our emissions primarily from the burning of fossil fuels. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about sustainability, right? And sustainability for the city is part of our general plan vision statement and a supporting principle as well in our general plan. And sustainability is really around that idea of meeting the needs of present without compromising the ability of our future generations to meet their own needs as well, really. So trying to find that balance so that we are not putting our children and grandchildren at greater risk and compromising their ability to meet their needs as well. Resilience is also one of the terms that we'll talk about, and we're going to focus really on resilience related to environment and climate change, but resilience really is broader than that. It really refers to that capacity of individuals, of communities, of systems, of institutions to be able to survive, to be able to adapt, to be able to thrive, when there are chronic stresses or acute shocks, right? So things like the pandemic was an acute shock, and the ability of those institutions and communities to still continue to thrive and adapt when those things happen. We'll be looking more with our Climate Compass around how those changes in in temperature, that extreme weather events, and how can the city still adapt to those and thrive even as those things happen. We're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about adaptation and mitigation and what are these two terms, how are they different? Climate adaptation really is around addressing the impacts of climate change on a community, and mitigation really looks at how do we minimize our contribution from greenhouse gas emissions to climate change. So We'll talk a little bit more about those two in a minute. The next slide, Hannah. Great. So what is the Climate Compass? So this is a document that is an update from our current 2019 Climate Action Plan, but we're looking at it on a broader scale. So it won't just be looking at climate mitigation. We'll be looking at adaptation. We'll be looking at resilience and sustainability. So really addressing a broader focus with it. So a Climate Action Plan is really that roadmap for greenhouse gas emission reductions. But as I said, we're looking at how do we also integrate adaptation and resilience strategies into this. We are looking at, identifying through our greenhouse gas inventory those existing emissions and looking at projected greenhouse gas emissions for the future and setting targets to reduce those emissions. So there are state guidelines around what the state targets are, but what should we as the city have as our targets, and how do we be consistent with what the state has? Establishing our Climate Compass will really look at establishing policies, actions to reduce those emissions and meet those reduction targets that we will be looking at setting. So we really also, with this document, want to have meaningful engagement with our community. We really want to hear from our community about what their priorities are, what is important to them, and really try and reflect that in this document, and really look at how do we implement, how do we make sure that we are putting in place actions that will really achieve those targets that we're setting. Next slide, Hannah. So then, as I mentioned before, mitigation versus adaptation, making sure people are clear on sort of the difference between these two. Right, so mitigation is really around reducing those greenhouse gas emissions, right? How do we get people to, in the transportation sector, how do we switch from gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, to bicycles, to more walking? How do we reduce our greenhouse gas footprint? And adaptation is really about how do we look at ways to make the city more able to adjust to what climate change is what we will see in our community with climate change. Given all of the decades of emissions, we will be seeing more impacts of climate change in the near and far future and farther future. And so how do we make sure that our community is able to really address those and withstand what we expect to see happening in terms of extreme heat and flooding? So those are sort of the differences between mitigation and adaptation. And I want to make sure people understand that or have any questions before we move on with the timeline of the project. So are there any questions on that? I don't see any in the chat. I don't see hands up, but Hannah, maybe I'm not seeing everybody. Okay. Okay, so then the next slide is on project timeline. So we did start this, we even started before this timeline in terms of our greenhouse gas inventory, but this timeline is starting with the update, and we've had a couple of pop-up events already. We had some events at the Giant Pumpkin Festival. We've been out to some of the markets that we've done. We've had some climate ambassador meetings for those of you who are some of our climate ambassadors. We've had one virtual, one in person. This is our first community workshop, and we will be doing another one in the future, and we'll be doing more pop-up events as well. We are hoping, our goal with this project is that by the end of next calendar year, we will have a new adopted climate action plan. We should have a draft of that along with the CEQA documentation for public review sometime next, I'm going to say late summer. It might be a good goal for that, to then be adopted by the end of the year. So this shows a little bit about where we are with it. You can also go on our website and see the timeline to know what to expect in terms of future steps and additional engagement. And I think with that, I am going to turn it back over to Hannah, who will get into the inventory.
Great, thanks, Carrie.
Mm.
So as Carrie mentioned, we recently finished the greenhouse gas inventory update. The city has done several greenhouse gas emissions inventories of the sources and sectors within the Elk Grove community that are contributing to overall greenhouse gas emissions. But I want to make sure that we're all first on the same page about what greenhouse gases we are looking at. And again, as we think about the key terms here, greenhouse gases are atmospheric gases. They mostly consist of water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and chlorofluorocarbons. There are 3 primary greenhouse gases that are quantified for the climate compass. Those are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And these gases are not created equally. Some of them have greater ability to contribute to climate change than others. So to be able to compare these among each other, they are each multiplied that are non-CO2 gases, so just methane and nitrous oxide, by their global warming potential, and then reported in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we list that as CO2e. These numbers for methane and nitrous oxide come from the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which is the latest global data on climate change. We also have to think about where to draw the boundary in terms of what does the city of Elk Grove as a jurisdiction have kind of authority or control over. Not everything is really within the bounds of the city's inventory. So this just depicts what we are including. Really what we're looking at is an annual snapshot in time of all of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions from 2021. This is a critical component to the beginning of the Climate Compass process. We'll be using this inventory to establish reduction goals and targets, and it'll be used to monitor emissions over time to see how the city is doing in terms of reaching its targets. So local government greenhouse gas inventories are based on activities that Elk Grove specifically has control over taking place within its boundaries. And there's basically 2 ways to kind of categorize these. There are the emissions that are produced by community-based sources, which are those located within the jurisdiction boundary, and then emissions that are produced as a consequence of community activities, and those are included in the region. And this is consistent with the U.S. Community Protocol for Accounting and Reporting Greenhouse Gas Emissions. This is the most widely followed protocol in the U.S., and it's recommended for use by local agencies by the California Air Resources Board. The greenhouse gas emissions inventory is made up of several sectors and sources. So sectors are really categories of greenhouse gas emissions. These include things like building energy, on-road transportation, off-road vehicles and equipment, solid waste, water supply, wastewater treatment, and agriculture. Sources are the specific physical processes within the jurisdiction's boundary that actually release greenhouse gas emissions. Think of combustion of gasoline in vehicles, whereas activities is really about the use of energy, materials, or services by members of the community that result in greenhouse gases, either directly, think of burning natural gas in your home for cooking, or indirectly, like electricity that might be created through a power plant that's outside of the jurisdiction. So all of these are incorporated into the emissions inventory, and here are the results. So overall, we're looking at about a little over 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent were generated by community activities within the city of Elk Grove in the year 2021. The largest piece of the pie is on-road transportation, accounting for 57% of the emissions, followed by building energy, which was 38% of emissions, and that includes both residential and non-residential buildings. There are some other smaller pieces of the pie here represented. Those include solid waste, off-road vehicles and equipment, agriculture, and then the smallest pieces of the pie at less than 1% are water supply and wastewater treatment. Let me just pause there and see if there are any questions on the greenhouse gas inventory. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but if anyone has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand and come off mute. Well, I don't think I'm seeing any, so we will keep moving here.
Hannah, we've got a question in the chat.
Oh, great. Sure. Could you elaborate on water supply? So when we think of greenhouse gas emissions from water supply, it's really the electricity needed to pump, treat, convey, distribute all of the water. So it's really about the grid electricity and its carbon intensity. So future workshops and meetings will dig more into what does this inventory look like moving forward as Elk Grove continues to evolve and grow, and what are the specific actions that we all can take to reduce emissions from these sectors. And clearly there will have to be a focus on building energy and on-road transportation, as those make up the vast majority of emissions in Elk Grove. We also want to talk about the key climate hazards that are currently and will continue to face Elk Grove in the future. So we've categorized these by 4 main types. There are certainly secondary and tertiary effects of these specific hazards, but we can kind of group them into these broad categories, and those include extreme heat, flooding, drought, and wildfire or smoke-related impacts. We all know that we're already seeing the effects, right? We're expecting things to become exacerbated with time, but Elk Grove has felt the impacts of flooding recently, of extreme heat over the summers, trying to save electricity during crucial times, dealing with fires and the impacts of wildfire smoke on our health. So these are things that we recognize are already happening, and not to be doom and gloom, but we want to kind of put this mindset out there because we want to think about, as part of this activity we're going to do, what are those things that folks feel concerned about? What are the vulnerable considerations in terms of Elk Grove's infrastructure, the people, its environment that we need to think about and protect as part of the climate compass. The city has already produced some really great plans around resiliency. One of those is the Community Mobility Resilience Plan that was prepared in 2021 that already looked at some of the climate hazards that I just spoke of. So focusing on 2 of them here, one of those being extreme heat. So as time goes on, as we think about greenhouse gas emissions continuing to be emitted in the future at a global scale, those will continue to have locally felt impacts. So in the near term, an increase in the annual number of extreme heat days. In Elk Grove, that's already a really high number. That's days that are exceeding 103.1 degrees Fahrenheit. So as we move towards longer out in the midterm and end of the century, we're just going to see an increase in the number of days that temperature is felt. And then even more specifically, the number of heat waves, the frequency of those will continue to increase with time. And those heat waves are defined as 4 consecutive days where the temperatures are reaching at least 103.1 degrees Fahrenheit. So You can see on the leftmost column is what we were experiencing kind of the 30 years prior to the turn of the century, and things just seem to be getting more and more extreme. And then in terms of the average heat wave duration, again, we expect there to be an increase in how long heat waves are going on in the city of Elk Grove. And I do see there's a question in the chat about how did you come up with the number of future days? And so this is all based on climate models and projections. There are a variety of climate models that have been overlaid and averaged to understand kind of all of the climate models that are out there. What do they all think is going to happen? And they're all trending in the same direction. This is derived from a tool called CalAdapt. It's specific to California. It's produced by the California Energy Commission, but dialed in at a really local level. So the models produce the specific number of days. And you know, the thing about models is it's not exact, right? So certain years you might have more or less of these things. This is looking at an average over you know, the next 30-year periods in each of these columns. And then thinking about flooding, we know there's already been impacts of floods and you know, the potential for levees to fail. This image again from the Community Mobility Resilience Plan is looking at the change in one-day rainfall periods during 2, 10, and 100-year storm events. We know that these are the types of events that are occurring more and more frequently. 100-year storm events used to mean it had a chance of occurring once in 100 years. That is really, we're no longer seeing that anymore. Things are happening more and more frequently. So interestingly, what the modeling is showing is that on average, these different watersheds in the short term might be experiencing a decrease in a 24-hour rainfall period in the mid-century, but really steep increase in the late century. Again, this is an average. So we've already seen some of these things in the 2-year cycle since this plan was produced in 2021. So, you know, it just gives a sense of scale and severity, but it's not very indicative of what's going to happen in a given year. But as we can note, you know, extreme heat and flooding are two of the significant climate hazards that Elk Grove faces, and I'm sure a lot of you have already experienced some of this. So we'll pause here for questions before we move into the more interactive component of this, and I see there are several coming up in the chat here. So I'll just go through these one at a time. The first question here is, does the report have a map showing the boundaries of the watersheds? That is a really good question. We can certainly provide a link to the Community Mobility Resilience Plan. Off the top of my head, I don't know that there is a map. Carrie, do you recall?
So there is, we actually have, if you, I'll post the webpage in the chat. And if you go to the webpage, there is actually a story map that goes through, and it does show the watersheds in there. So you will be able to see that in the report.
Great. The next question is, does this consider the areas of Elk Grove that were vernal pool areas not directly connected to streams or creeks? That also is a good question. You know, we would have to, I don't believe it's looking at vernal pool areas. I really think it's looking at a broader watershed scale. But yeah, Carrie, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, we did not look at vernal pools separately. Yeah, we just looked at the watersheds.
Great, and then there's just some comments in the chat. Construction codes in the future will require 500-year flood hazard area for many buildings. Right, we're seeing some changes in thinking about climate impacts in the more near term. So thanks for that, Joe. air quality / pollution from residential, commercial, industrial sources, gas appliances and tools, transportation, equipment, etc. also contributes. And yes, absolutely. Air quality is certainly another hazard that folks are facing, particularly in the Sacramento Valley. Great. Any other questions? All right, hearing none. We are going to, oh, Joe, go ahead.
This is Bob Lilly. I'm at Joe's house. We're both watching from the same computer here.
Okay.
Okay. What about flooding from the increase in the sea level? By 2100, it will the 100-year floodplain from the increase in sea level will hit about 30% of Elk Grove. Well, there's several things with the creeks that you're using. Morrison Creek is not in Elk Grove, it's north. Snodgrass Slough is south, also not in Elk Grove. The main creek in Elk Grove is Laguna Creek and Elk Grove Creek that goes through the system. So the creek that you have on Casunas River and those two creeks are together as far as their 100-year flooding. So I am puzzled by your choice of creeks.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So I think we're looking at broader watersheds. They're just given the name of the local creek, but we're looking at the impact, the wider spread impact of if these watersheds were to receive this amount of rainfall, the effects on Elk Grove.
I would also, add and encourage, so for each of so when we did our resilience plan a few years ago, we did do a fairly detailed white paper. So there's the report that's actually done, and then for the precipitation and flooding, there is a very detailed 100+ page white paper that gets into all of the very detailed modeling, why we made certain choices, why these different things were selected with that. And so I would encourage folks, if they're really interested in these topics, you can go in, and the website that I linked to in the chat has all of that information in there.
Thanks, Carrie. And then I do see one other question in the chat from Lynn. What is the risk of flood in areas the city has built in flood? I think that means floodplain. What is the risk of flood in areas the city has built? I'm not sure that, flood risk is evaluated on different timescales in terms of the intensity of different storms. So Lynn, if there are like specific developments that you're thinking of, let us know where the buildings are, the flood plan roads. I'm not. Carrie, are you?
So there in some instances, particularly, and I'm not in our public works team. Our public works team can talk about this much more eloquently than I can. There are some instances, particularly in some of the residential areas, where the roads are actually purposefully built, right? The houses are elevated some, the roads are actually intended to sort of collect and gather water. And then, for those bigger rain events, and then move that through without then flooding the houses. So there is some intentionalities to the roads being a little bit lower and the houses being higher in certain developments in the city. Again, I would also, point you, Lynn, to look at the more detailed white paper. With that, there are, right, in addition to, the different areas that are specifically in the 100 or 200-year floodplain in Elk Grove, we also do have the levees, which are intended to help, prevent flooding within those areas of the city. And so there is a lot of detail in that, those white papers about all of that work.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And Lynn, absolutely recognize your concern about emergency equipment. I think that's exactly what we want to get into during the during this exercise is what are those concerns, if they're infrastructural or societal. So hold that thought, and we're going to come right back to it. Joe, I see you've got your hand up, or whoever is representing this line.
Okay. Hi, this is Suzanne and I. Yeah, we're all over Joe's house, Joe and Laura's house. Are we going to be covering what the impact of flooding would be on the wastewater treatment plant, which is the second largest one in the United States? And it's the low point on the edge of Elk Grove, Laguna Creek, and how that would have a huge impact on Elk Grove?
So I think, and I don't want to get us too off topic. The resilience plan has a lot of information, and there are a lot of strategies in there related to, you know, the need to address flooding. It does highlight certain areas within the city that are more prone to, and strategies that the city can do for that. With this Climate Compass document, what we're trying to really focus on is, with respect to resilience and with respect to sustainability, looking at those things that aren't already dealt with in some of our other plans, right? So in addition to having the Climate Compass be our climate action plan, what are things that may have been left out, that weren't addressed when we did our resilience plan, that maybe technology or understanding has moved on further in the last couple of years, and we might need to think a little bit more about that, rather than necessarily going back and changing a lot of stuff that or repeating a lot of stuff that we've already done in some of those other documents.
So the white paper then, Carrie, would address this, because this has a huge impact on Elk Grove. I don't think people really understand how much impact that would be on the infiltration in fluid. I'm just sharing that because
yeah,
it's so huge.
Yeah, no, it does. We involved, when we did our resilience plan, we had Regional SAN was there at the table with us. They were part of that working group related to flooding, as was the Sacramento Area Flood Control District. You know, so they were part of the development of that plan.
Okay, and that's in the white paper then?
Yeah, so it's in it's talked about in the white paper.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Great questions. I think we'll go ahead and move to our next section here. So as we mentioned, this is really about identifying both vulnerabilities, but also strengths, because we really want to understand what are those strengths out there that we can build upon for the Climate Compass that are going to help address some of the vulnerabilities that we've identified. So what we're going to stay in one room, just given kind of the number of folks that are here. It seems like there's more folks, but there's a lot of people representing the project team. And so we're going to just be in the background here. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Luis, to lead us through this exercise. But really, we're going to talk about these three different kind of pillars of infrastructure, society, and environment, and think about different vulnerabilities and then community strengths. So when we think about infrastructure, we're talking about buildings, housing, bridges, utilities, things like that. For societal vulnerabilities, we're going to be considering healthcare, food, emergency response. Lynn, what you were speaking to, I think fits in well with the societal category. Environmental considerations, so pollution, recreation, tree cover would be examples. And so we will start sharing a different mural board that's an interactive whiteboard. Before we do that, just want to keep in mind rules for discussion. We ask that everybody please be here now. One speaker at a time. We'll use the raise hand feature. Folks can come off mute. Step up to voice your thoughts, but also if you've been speaking a lot, please step back to let others chime in as well. And seek to be additive, not repetitive. And please listen actively, seeking to understand and keeping an open mind of everyone in the room. And we'll be taking about 45 minutes or so to do this and then wrapping things up. So I will stop my screen share and turn things over to Luis.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Montes. I will be helping facilitate this exercise. Really, we want to hear from each of you of the strengths and vulnerabilities, because who knows better than residents who may have experienced, have personal experience with that they want to reflect on. So I will be sharing my screen. I'll take a minute to orientate everyone. So I'm sharing my screen. We are looking at the mural board. Each of you won't have to do anything other than raise your hand or write a message in the chat regarding the vulnerabilities. So I will zoom in on each section. So each section represents a different vulnerability that we will be discussing. And I will do my best to keep track and call on people, but we have a big team that will be supporting and making sure information is being captured. So let me just make sure I have our chat open. I am zooming in. Can everyone see our first area of focus that we will be focusing on? Great. So infrastructure vulnerabilities will be the first section. We'll be looking at buildings, houses, roads, bridges, utilities. We do have an example just to get us started. You know, for example, Elk Grove. So we want to identify a feature and then see if there are correlating vulnerabilities with extreme heat, flooding, drought, or wildfire. There may be more than one. There may just be one. Like I said, we do have an example here to get us started. So a community feature in the city of Elk Grove, an example is Elk Grove Boulevard. And I know earlier this year, we experienced record rain, record flooding, and you know, there was the possibility of roads being blocked during those major storms. So that is an example of a vulnerability. There could be others. I heard one earlier that we were getting into about solid waste plants and you know, the vulnerability to flooding that might bring to the city. That is a great example. If there are others, feel free, please raise your hand and we can begin a discussion. If you're more comfortable typing in the chat, feel free to do that as well. But I will be providing some guidance and some guiding questions, but we definitely want to hear from each of you.
How do you raise your hand? Like this?
That works. Go, since you're unmuted, Sandra, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think Elk Grove Boulevard could suffers in times of extreme heat because it has walking and bike paths that would be too hot to walk on or bike on.
Yeah, that's a great one. Just some things to think about as we work through infrastructural vulnerabilities. You know, what makes an infrastructure vulnerable? Oh, Timothy, go for it.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, you can. Okay. With respect to extreme heat and flooding, we should think about our parks. Extreme heat. I've seen so many trees with limb drops, you know, on the sidewalks and pathways. It's a danger and also a nuisance. The flooding, also, there are areas of our parks, even our new preserve has a big, extremely large puddle to last winter. And so we keep an eye on keeping those walkways from having localized flooding and not making them accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely a vulnerability that I think is top of mind for many. That actually falls within environmental vulnerabilities, which we will be getting at soon. But I'll make sure that our team has logged that within the environmental vulnerabilities section, and we'll get to that in a second. But yes, thank you for sharing that one. Any others in thinking of location of a building or infrastructure, possibly the age, building codes that might be outdated, or a particular housing type? Those are all things to think about as we assess, the city of Elk Grove's infrastructure vulnerabilities. Pamela, go for it. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. What about lighting in our communities? It's kind of we're not using energy efficient lighting. Some is like even in new development, some lights are just too harsh. I look at this Apple complex here, and it's like beautiful lighting in their parking lots, not too much glare, and I'm sure they're saving a ton of energy there. But it's like our lighting here. It's like for commercial areas, it's just too glaring. I don't know if we're using too much light for that, and even in housing developments, I don't know if they're like we're using efficient lighting.
There it is.
Yeah, Pamela, thank you for sharing that one. I think that's definitely something worth logging as it relates to utilities and where we're getting our energy from. So I appreciate you for sharing that one. And then I am just looking at the chat. We have roadways for extreme heat and absent of tree cover. Elk Grove and areas not being bike path friendly. And then housing development in the cities have changed lighting to efficient energy. So we're requesting that, sounds like. Pamela, do you still have more to add? I see your hand is still up.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm going to put my hand.
All good. William, I did see you go off mute for a little bit. Feel free to unmute if you want to share anything.
Damn, I can't get the thing. Am I on? Am I off now?
You're good. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. On extreme heat, there's a lot of evidence that it has massive effects on health, public health. And I think the health effects ought to be really looked at. Some of us are trying to develop a way to look at that, but it's extremely important. We know it has a lot of effect on heart, asthma, as also related to the wildfire issue. But I think the human health is a really major issue that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. That might be a good segue into our next vulnerability focus, but I do, which we will be looking at societal vulnerabilities, and health is absolutely one of those. But before we move on, I do want to just make sure, double check that no one has any final thoughts or any other just guidance or recommendation when it comes to the consequences of certain infrastructures being vulnerable. For example, lack of access to a critical facility. What might that impact have on residents? And what should we keep in mind as we move forward? Eugene?
Hi, I added a comment in the chat regarding any kind of vacant private or public parcels. that are susceptible for extreme dry weather kind of conditions and fire?
Yeah, so just generally certain, whether they be private or public infrastructure sites being susceptible to wildfire, particularly during drought conditions and dry weather. That's definitely one worth adding. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I see more on severe heat and drought conditions and the impact that has on our lawns and, you know, transitioning to more native plants. And then infrastructure that uses greenhouse gases impose vulnerabilities on everything. Paul, would you mind, not to call you out, but if you're comfortable going off mute, elaborating on that a little bit more?
I'm glad to give it a shot. I'm not quite sure how fully I understand the process and protocol, but in terms of vulnerability, I think that as was present in the home energy shows over the last couple of years, that the move from greenhouse gases, particularly fossil fuels, to electrification has got to be primary in planning for the future for ourselves and for our grandchildren and those not yet born. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I see some thumbs up from others in the room as well on that topic.
And if I could just chime in there for a minute, I think, you know, Paul, that's really where we're going to get into decarbonization and really like transitioning infrastructure in subsequent meetings as part of this project. And I know that, you know, it all impacts kind of resiliency. So I just want to know that it might not fit neatly into a box here, but it's something as part of the big picture for the climate compass that we're going to be focused on.
Joe.
Hi, this is Susanna. Under drought as well as heat, I think vulnerability is the lack of subsurface watering of trees, deep watering subsurface using recycled water like gray water to really consistently, you know, feed the trees so they don't die, especially those new ones that need to be planted to reach our goal.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make sure that recycling gray water as a opportunity is noted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other final thoughts on this section before we move to the next one, Eugene?
Yes, just related to the prior comment, maybe it's a lack of infrastructure that actually facilitates that kind of smart kind of use of natural resources. You know, how do we get to that goal? You know, so, you know, being able to be smarter in water use by using other sources of water.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I do want to do a quick time check to make sure that we leave room for all the other parts of this exercise. Are there any other final thoughts? I think I did see, okay, the questions are being answered. Any other final thoughts before we move on to the next vulnerability? Awesome. So thank you for that. We are going to go on to our next vulnerability. And, you know, if you still have thoughts on infrastructure vulnerabilities, feel free to add them to the chat and we will move them over. But we are moving on to societal vulnerabilities now. So thinking about healthcare, you know, we just chatted about how extreme heat has a huge impact on public health. Other things to think about are our food systems and emergency response. You know, during these flood events or during wildfire extreme heat events, what are some vulnerabilities that our emergency services might experience that we need to be aware of? Similar to like before, feel free to raise your hand if you have any additional thoughts as we move forward. You know, some other things to think about are, you know, maybe particular community groups or populations living in high-risk areas. Some that come to mind are elderly or senior citizens, you know, low or moderate income groups, or groups with special needs. Another thing to think about are how can hazards intensify some of these characteristics, or where are there areas of improvement in some of these societal areas in the city of Sacramento. I'm sorry, Elk Grove. You know, when we think of human health, one major impact we saw, and that was documented, was wildfire and some of the smoke impacts that come from that. You know, I know if we reflect, there were definitely some bad air quality days that we experienced in Elk Grove. You know, extreme heat. Just came out of summer not that long ago and experienced some heat. I know we mentioned you know, roads, but what are some of the health impacts that heat causes? Just navigating the chat, food sources.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
What are we going to do with this? Why are we doing this?
So we want to hear from residents of direct vulnerabilities that they've experienced to help influence the development of the Climate Compass, the updated climate action plan. You know, residents know best some of the impacts, the direct climate impacts that they are experiencing. So this is an opportunity for us to really get a deep dive and an understanding of some of the direct impacts that residents are feeling. So we want to hear this is an opportunity to get input and feedback directly from you to help influence the development of this climate action plan. And Hannah, feel free to.
Yeah, I can just add, you know, I think Sandra, we're still in the kind of early stages of developing the plan, but we want to put forth policies, you know, we call them measures and actions that are really going to actually address these vulnerabilities. So having as much detail as we can help craft policy that's really specific and actually targets what these vulnerabilities are.
Did you turn it off? Did you turn it off?
Bill, it looks like you came off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just put it in, actually wrote it in. The pollution actually kills about 7 million people, 7 to 8 million people every year in the world. And one of the worst kinds of pollution is, in fact, the wildfire. But I would add to it, I would not constrain it to wildfire. The other pollutions that go along with it we produce, they mix with it, actually what happens. So I think you have to look at all pollution, not just wildfire pollution. Well, wildfire, it certainly has a big effect on it. And it has massive health effects. And there's a huge literature on it, by the way. So, I mean, we don't need to go into it here. But it kills people.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely an important one that has come up multiple times in conversations. So I know that there are many others who agree with you on that one.
Now, my question, what I don't understand from ascent is what degree you get into that. Some of us work on these issues in the city, like on the health issues, but we don't have contact with other people. We don't know what you do and you don't know what we do. I mean, how does one sort of get link hands on those things?
Yeah, I am gonna pass that question over to Hannah for some support on that one.
Bill, I'm not familiar with who are you representing? What health group are you representing?
We're not a health group. Well, we're a Compassionate Grove, but we've been working on health issue for some time. We're actually working with people from UC Davis, Seattle Medical, the medical center, and PSR and others. We've been working on heat effects and things like this for some time now, but we never have anybody to talk to. We talk between ourselves and the community, but we're never in touch with anybody on this kind of, So we don't know. I've asked several times. I don't know what kind of homework you do. Do you go back and go through all of these data like we do? Or are we doing something you don't do, or you do something we don't do? I just have no idea what you do and what the community does.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think we're trying to bridge some of that gap here by having some community workshops, but there might be opportunity to have more specific conversations. We'd be happy to see what resources it is that you're looking at. What we're typically looking at is, in terms of the data, we're looking at electricity, natural gas.
No, I want to come back to the health. I'm speaking about health data for extreme heat and pollution.
So we can look at vulnerabilities in terms of the impacts of kind of hospitalization and things like that. So it depends on kind of where this project is going to lead us. If there is a strong interest from the community in addressing more health-related impacts due to climate change as part of the climate compass.
Well, if we go to the hospital and we die, I mean, we're kind of interested in that,
Sure. I think it would be good for us to maybe exchange some contact information and hear more about what you all are looking into in terms of the data that you just mentioned. And
we're in touch with Carrie, maybe work through Carrie.
Sure.
But we have a group of us working already on this stuff, and and if you it's gonna be helpful,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Carrie will put us in touch.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, William. I think this is why we want to do this engagement, is to find people doing some of the work and some of the feedback we can get from that. So thanks, William, for sharing that. I did see another, power outages that occur due to extreme heat and the overuse of AC. Thank you, Carol, for sharing that one. Emergency energy and battery storage, and some of the challenges that come with that, especially during extreme heat events. And then wildfire pollutants. Yeah, a lot of, especially in Elk Grove, I think we don't initially think of wildfire as being an immediate impact, but wildfire smoke is not specific to a location, as we've experienced during some of those bad air quality days that we've had due to wildfires that were not near us. Joe?
This is Susanna. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a vulnerability is the need for more cooling stations or areas. So there's more of a matrix across the city rather than just in a few areas, because this heat extreme is going to continue to exacerbate. So really having more of a sustained infrastructure for cooling centers, and not just to house people, but there's families and kids. So centers that can allow them to play and act, and do activities, but also be safe in the heat.
Yeah, absolutely. Supporting, those who are vulnerable to heat risks, and ensuring that there's a system that sets up cooling centers. Yeah, thank you for sharing that one.
And also just as a, just if we really could be like layered, so that if you have young children, 5 and under, you'd want to go to this type of, there'd be enough so that they could go to this type of center for those types of activities versus elders versus, so it would have not just a generic place to be. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Any others before we move on to environmental vulnerabilities? I'm not hearing any, so I'm going to move on to our next vulnerability. This one, and you can see it's already begun to be populated because we've touched upon it a little bit as we've done this exercise. But now moving on to environmental vulnerabilities. You know, looking at our the city of Elk Grove's parks infrastructure, tree canopy cover, recreation amenities. Repeating, you know, the park's concern that we heard, you know, with fallen tree limbs and damage that caused. You know, we saw a lot of that during the flooding events, and also the impact that extreme heat is having and drought are having on trees, and some of the health deterioration that trees are experiencing as a result. Any other environmental vulnerabilities? You know, what effects might some of these hazards have on our parks or tree canopy cover or recreation amenities? Any thoughts at all?
I can't get my hand to raise, but I can.
Go for it. The floor is yours.
Okay. One of the really big things that we haven't dealt with here as a whole, but there's, just as you might know, 200 journals, over 200 health and medical journals in the world on the same day, 25th of October, produced a declaration about the enormous necessity of seeing human and environmental health all together in the same thing. And they tied it to basically the species disappearance. Okay, and we've not dealt with that, but we have. Well, not only do we have our trees and so on, but we have all of the things that link to them. We're heavy on oak trees. Oak trees are the best hosts in the world as a group for trees, for all other kinds of wildlife, and you know, right down to fungi. And so we need to have a broader view of that natural world that we're affecting, and in two ways. One is that as it disappears, that's going to affect our health, and that's a whole separate situation to be discussed, but it needs to be put on the agenda. The second thing is that we are absolutely sort of killing ourselves in the long run as we kill off, you know, the nature around us. So just protecting our trees, while that's a start, we need to be looking at the biosphere more generally, you know, and that would include a wider variety of plants and animals and so forth than perhaps we're thinking of. We need to be looking at it more holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. The conservation plays a huge role in this, and mitigating some of the climate impacts that we're anticipated to experience. But just as a follow-up question to you, William, are there any particular areas that come to mind when you?
Absolutely, yes. I live in Sheldon, and I would like to suggest, you know, I might not have a lot of neighbors who back me on this, so I may be sticking my neck way out here. But I think, you know, originally we were a rural area because people thought, well, of our animals we raised. We all had kids in 4-H, and we had chickens and cows and all that kind of thing out here. And our kids grew up, and then we stayed, and so now, you know, the rural part in terms of agriculture has disappeared, but the need for conservation is just going up, you know, every year. No, and we have all these trees and stuff. We've also planted over 1,200 trees out here ourselves. Okay, oaks. Okay, you know, as our own. And I would think that given that the need for it and what we've been learning about even the proximity of arborized areas, we might think about treating this whole rural area as a conservation area and be thinking about it. You know, for a good example would be Singapore. Singapore is very different from us, obviously, climatically, but they've gone to a great deal of trouble to think about how to place their trees and the trees alongside and so on. And I think we could be thinking much more comprehensively about arborization and the rest of the things that go with it, you know, and try and treat maybe our rural area as a conservation area for that purpose. I based on a webinar that I actually attended, you know, that the city put on, it seems to me that I heard them say we should be able to drop our heat island effect by 4 or 5 degrees, just what we do with arborization. That's a big deal.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Timothy.
Yes. With respect to drought, every time we have a drought event, I look at our parks, our wonderful parks, but they have so much grass. And there may be a time, not 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but in the distant future, the timeline that we're considering in this study or exercise, that we need to move to a new type of park that is much more economical in terms of water use. And I personally would be interested in encouraging the CSD to maybe develop a demonstration park. You know, we have the demonstration drought tolerant garden, which is wonderful. What about a park? Maybe it would use AstroTurf for sports fields. I know that when I walk around our park, we have areas that are depressed and they tend to be cool because of just the water in the area, the subsurface water. You know, maybe we can make use of those effects to make the park more amenable to high temperature extremes and droughts. Just something to think about. And it would be a tool to introduce community members to this new idea or new way of thinking.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy, for sharing that. I know I'm seeing some others that are being listed, you know, with our man-made lakes in Laguna West and the impact that drought will have on that. Less parking lot structures and more gardens and ponds to capture rainwater. So thank you, everyone, for sharing these. Now, do we have any other final thoughts before we move on to the final portion of this exercise? We will continue moving. Oh, yes, go for it. Whoever is on the other side of Joe Kane. Go.
Hi, a quick one. I've had several kids tell me they want to have throughout, if you really want them to take the bus or you want them to be able to, older people to be safe in the heat, they need to have shelters for every bus stop because they burn up. The kids are like, please have a shelter for us that has shade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great one. Whether it be, you know, built shade or shade from tree canopy, I think that's a great one to bring up. Any others? Oh, sorry.
Tree canopy would be great. I mean, a natural canopy would be fantastic too, but some kind of shade. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And just so we have enough time for the last exercise, I am going to move us on so we have some time just to wrap up at the end. So we chatted about vulnerabilities. Now, what we want to end on a positive note, and we want to get an idea of what are the community strengths in each of these 3 areas. You know, I was already starting to hear some. I think, Timothy, you were mentioning that there are some parks where you do feel cool. You know, we want to hear those parks. What are those spaces that, you know, during extreme heat, you felt cool, or during heavy rains, you felt safe? Maybe there's a particular park that you enjoy, or a building that has a particular strength that you want us to make a note of. But yeah, it doesn't, we don't have to stick to infrastructure, societal, environmental. If there are any that come to mind, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we'll make sure to highlight it. Things to think about: what are strengths of people and services in the city of Elk Grove? Is there a reliable communication protocol? Is there a great, system of well-supported volunteers? Preparedness plans. Those are all things to think about in terms of strengths. I see many new residential buildings are being built with solar panels and fully electrified. Thanks, Carol, for sharing that one. Oh, grass areas in the park as another. I see a shout out to Elk Grove Regional Park for their tree canopy. Are there any other specific LED certified buildings, maybe elevated roads to address flooding, certain natural resources that we feel, have really supported Elk Grove? Electrical charging stations are increasing. That's a great observation. Bike trails throughout Elk Grove that have recently been added green for safety. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Deborah?
Sorry, I was just trying to figure this out on the thing. So I was wondering, I don't know how true this is, but I would like to know, in Old Town, is it true? Because from what I understand, the infrastructure of Old Town is very close to the road, like the sewer and everything. If there was a flood, would Old Town have a sewer issue?
Carrie, I see you nodding.
That
Did
is
you
a
hear me?
really, yeah,
Oh.
I did hear you, and that is a really good question, and one that I am not actually prepared to answer right now, because I'm not the expert in that area, but we can definitely, find that out and look into that.
That would be good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that, Deborah. Also seeing a big shout out to the Elk Grove staff and their motivation for this CAP update. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. Well, I'm not seeing any more hands. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up? Just moving some of those final thoughts in the chat over. What I think, if that is it, Deborah, you still have your hand raised. I just want to make sure you don't have any additional comments, or if you do, feel free to add them. Oh, I see farmers markets as one. Yeah, all great feedback. Oh, another shout out to the recycling center for old paint and hazardous materials. Great. I'll do one more request for hands before we move forward. Community events year round. That's another great one. Awesome. Well, I think we are at time now. Oh, sorry. We have one more minute, actually. Joe Kane or whoever is.
Hi, this is Susanna. Just wanted to, we just have so many cultural groups, and being able to tap them to help us, with these is really critical. But linking them, I think, is the part that is challenging. But really, it's such a wonderful thing. Our community is so diverse, and having that, I think that's really a plus.
Yeah, absolutely. Diversity is absolutely a strength, and it's unique to every community. So thank you for highlighting that one.
Great. Well, Luis, I think I will move us over to some next steps here.
Awesome.
Great. Yeah, we want to be respectful of folks' time and just want to thank you so much for spending some time this evening with us. This is just the beginning of this project, so really appreciate everyone's enthusiasm and ideas. There will be more opportunities for outreach, conversations with the team here. We'll be making more technical information available soon. More materials will be coming to the city's website. Please make sure you're signed up for our notifications. And if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to Carrie directly. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. We'll stick around for a few minutes if there's any other questions, but have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you all for joining.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Deborah.
Okay, so I didn't know what this meeting was going to be exactly. And so I had a question about something I felt like I'd started from when I went to the ambassador meeting. I don't know if this would be a good time to ask.
You're more than welcome.
Okay, so because I had looked into the elementary science curriculum, because I had brought up a question about implementing a Elk Grove like connection with the school to the climate and the control, like, or the so I went through the different 4th and 5th, 6th grade science stuff, and I found that the 5th grade science core had the most connection to what the discussions had been. And so I just wanted to know, is that something I should continue with? Is that something that you want to go as far as next kind of step in the future? I sort of want to know your guys' before I put a lot of time and effort into it. I want to know, is this something that we really, is this the direction you want us to be going at all?
So I think one of the questions is going to be, then approaching the school district, right? With the 5th grade, there's what, 42 elementary schools, right? And Crystal does a lot more work directly with the school district in her role. And so might have a better sort of sense of how much, since the school district and the city are sort of separate entities, how much are we able to approach on a wider scale? We have had a lot of success. For example, we're doing a program right now specifically with Franklin High School students. They have a group that does coding, and we're working with them on an augmented reality project. We have success approaching individual schools. It can be a little bit more challenging with the district as a whole and getting a change across the entire sort of school district and all of the schools.
I wasn't talking about changing. That's why I went through their core science, and I was looking at what we could connect with so that they could use it as more of a field trip type thing, a resource that they could say, hey, can you come in and do an in-class field trip, where we could put something together and say, okay, here's how your science connects to where you live. This is sort of what you do here affects this, and this is how this affects, and sort of ties them into Elk Grove and creates that awareness. Does that make sense? So it's not trying to change their system, it's piggybacking on it and giving them augmenting, exactly.
Yeah. So Deborah, I'd love to chat about that. We, like Carrie mentioned, we do work with the school district, although we are very different entities legally.
Yeah.
I think taking the science curriculum and applying it in real life and showing how it matters to them and their neighborhood and things that they can do and making that actionable is huge, right? This is how we're going to see the behavior change. So when you're looking at stuff, I mean, we both talk at the district level. My advice there would be to reach out to school board members and express, your desire to do that link. And then the school board then informs the superintendent. But we also see a lot of movement if we have a principal that is open to this and having volunteers.
I talked to my kid's principal, and she actually provided me the curriculum information and everything so that I could figure it out. And so she said, well, it has to line up with the curriculum, and that's why I started there.
Yeah. And maybe and I can connect the three of us, maybe Deborah, you have my email, I think, from the Climate Ambassadors program. And so maybe we can start thinking about it as a pilot with a school, right? And if you have a connection with a school, trying to figure out how it would work as a pilot and what that might look like. And then, so the three of us can connect and talk about that more.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I was going to sort of put general things together, and I know you guys have a lot more resources. And so I was going to put together maybe a Google Slides to start. Is that something that you would be open to as far as a slides that we could just all share or put information to?
Yeah. And I did want to flag, Eugene just did a shout out for Sacramento Splash. They're amazing. And they have a lot of this curriculum, and they actually do a lot already where they bring in a career professional to talk about it in real life in that job and connect it. So working with Sacramento Splash, which is a regional nonprofit, would be amazing too. So thanks, Eugene.
Yeah, I'm board treasurer, so a little self-promotion here.
But it's a huge asset, right? So part of this is understanding who's in this space and what is everyone doing and how can we work together, to go back to Bill Myers's question of where do we connect? That's one of these goals. So if we see opportunities to connect, even if it hasn't been done before, let's have a conversation.
Right. So we already
can do.
Yeah, we have a communication infrastructure in place right now. And so, the Nicholas Dairy is a very popular field trip currently with the school district, which we maintain. Yeah.
And that's a big one because methane is such a massive contributor. And methane comes from cows. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to follow up with you, Eugene Lee, or on the Sacramento Splash. Is there a way to have contacts here?
I'd be happy to talk with you offline. Yeah.
So if it's okay with you, Eugene, because I have Eugene and I have Deborah, I have both of your emails from the climate ambassadors. So if it's okay with you guys, I am happy to get you guys connected as well.
Great. Thanks, Carrie.
Awesome. Yep, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay. Carol, did you have something?
Yeah, I just, I'm a retired nurse, and I feel that our youth are getting more and more informed. I've recently done some youth ministry work, and when I've talked about climate change, the kids are pretty knowledgeable and pretty on board. But I do think it's our seniors that need more education. And if there's any capacity to do any health teachings in the community on that, I'm willing to do that. I have a talk that I'm doing on heart health for the Rotary Club in 2 weeks. But I would be more than willing to try to be a part of a team to create a curriculum for the multitude of senior centers around Elk Grove.
That's awesome, Carol. Have you spoken to anybody at Glenbrook yet? Do you know how to reach out to them?
No, I'm new to all this, so yeah.
Okay, so I'm presenting to Glenbrook tomorrow on the city's budget, but I can sort of put a bug in their ear and reach out and try to connect, because I think you're right. I think our youth has grown up with this, and so it's normal for them to talk about climate change. They've heard it. They're on board for the action. But there's, differences amongst the generations. So I agree. That's an opportunity for sure. And I dropped my email. I'm not Carrie. I don't run this program, but I am like this funny little thing that you can poke if you need stuff. And I can help you connect to Glenbrook for sure, Carol.
Any last questions? Thank you all for taking the time. I'm sorry we're a few minutes late.
Yeah, the enthusiasm is really exciting. I love that folks are staying late and having even more ideas. This is really exciting. So yeah, thank you all. And well, it sounds like there's lots more discussions forthcoming. So thanks. And yeah, we'll see you at the next workshop, hopefully.
Well.